Hello and welcome. Thank you for watching this video on Jeremiah chapters 34 through 45. That's what we're going to be looking at today. If you haven't watched the previous videos in this series, I would say go back and watch those videos. That way you can be brought up to speed on what we're looking at this afternoon. So I would just remind you about the overall structure of the prophet Jeremiah's book, that the first and last chapter in the book kind of function as bookends. The first chapter, Jeremiah's call to ministry, and then the last chapter records Jerusalem's fall and its destruction. And then the majority of the book is the bread that creates the comfort sandwich. And that's what we're looking at again today. We're in the portion that's speaking about the condemnation of Judah and the nations. And we're going to be covering two major sections in those chapters today. We're going to be looking at chapters 34 and 35, which comprise a section on judgment upon the specific kings and leaders. And then we're going to be looking at 36 to 45, which encompass Judah's fall and exile. So if we look at this portion first, the judgment upon specific kings, you're going to see a contrast between the unfaithfulness of King Zedekiah, who was the king when Jerusalem was finally destroyed in the third invasion of the Babylonians in 586. Zedekiah was king, and it was because of his unfaithfulness. And his unfaithfulness in chapter 34 is going to be compared with the faithfulness of the Rechabites in chapter 35. Very interesting story in chapter 35 about this family that has followed and obeyed the teaching of their father not to drink alcohol. And Jeremiah calls them in and says, hey, drink. And he says, we can't do that. We've made a commitment that we will never drink alcohol. And they ultimately are held up in contrast to the nation of Judah and King Zedekiah. And Jeremiah and the Lord are saying, hey, look at these covenant keepers. They are following this covenant, this commitment that they have made, and they're going to be blessed. But Judah, you have not fulfilled your covenant. You haven't kept your word, and you're going to be cursed as a result. So that's what we see in chapters 34 and 35, this judgment upon specific kings and leaders. And then in chapters 36 to 45, we're going to see the explanation and the aftermath of Jerusalem's destruction by the Babylonians in 586 and being carried off into exile. So in chapter 36, 37, and 38, we're going to have an explanation as to why Jerusalem was destroyed. Again, it's going to be a reiteration of the unfaithfulness of two of their kings. The first king who's going to be called out for his unfaithfulness is King Jehoiakim. In chapter 36, we have this story of Jeremiah writing and sending a scroll to King Jehoiakim, and rather than hearing what it says and receiving it and repenting of his sin and leading the nation astray, he takes the scroll and burns it. And so that rejection of the word of Jeremiah, and Jeremiah ultimately is going to rewrite everything that he had written. And then chapters 37 and 38 are going to show how King Zedekiah was unfaithful. So King Jehoiakim was a king from 609 to 597, and then King Zedekiah from 597 to 586, with a short reign of another king in between them. But they were both unfaithful, and they are the reason, their rejection of the word of the Lord that came to Judah through the prophet Jeremiah, their rejection of that word is why Jerusalem was destroyed. And so that's going to be explained. And then chapter 39 is going to be a record of the destruction of Jerusalem, that everything that Jeremiah has said is going to come to pass actually comes to pass. And Jeremiah is very specific about giving dates to the siege of Jerusalem by the Babylonians, which lasts for 2.5 years, from January of 588 to July of 586. And then King Zedekiah is taken away into exile and as a captive of King Nebuchadnezzar, just as Jeremiah said would happen. But then Jeremiah and Ebed-Melech, the Ethiopian who helps Jeremiah out of the cistern in chapter 38, he is delivered. Both of them are delivered while the king Zedekiah is taken away into exile. Again, we have a contrast of faithfulness versus unfaithfulness and the results of that come to pass. And then chapters 40 through 44 then record what happens after Jerusalem is destroyed in 586. And we see that Jeremiah is given the option of whether he wants to stay in the land of Judah or if he wants to go to Babylon. King Nebuchadnezzar says, hey, whatever he wants to do, you let him do that. And so Jeremiah opts to stay in Judah, and Nebuchadnezzar places a man named Gedaliah as the governor of the land or the territory of Judah. And then ultimately in chapter 41, Gedaliah is going to be murdered by a man named Ishmael. There's this conspiracy against him. And then chapter 42 records there were some military leaders who had survived the siege of Jerusalem. They had run off, and then now they were ultimately the leaders of those who are left in the land. And because they had just seen Gedaliah, the king's governor, murdered, they are worried that the King Nebuchadnezzar is going to come back again and destroy them for a fourth time. And so that the leaders of the army, the commanders, come to Jeremiah and say, Jeremiah, what does God want us to do? Can you give us a word from Yahweh? And Jeremiah prays, and about 10 days later, he gets a word from Yahweh, and he says, yeah, we're supposed to stay here. We're supposed to live in faith, stay in the land of Judah, and God will plant us and build us here. And if we run away, again, there was a temptation for them to run to Egypt for safety to try and get away from Nebuchadnezzar. Jeremiah says, if we run away to Egypt, God will ultimately find us there. He will send Nebuchadnezzar to find us there in Egypt, and he will destroy us there. We're called to live in faith right here in the land. And so even though the commanders of the army come and say, whatever the word of the Lord is, we will obey it. Ultimately, they don't. And in chapter 43, after hearing that word of the Lord in chapter 42, they decide to run to Egypt, to look to Egypt and Pharaoh for safety rather than turning to the Lord. And then chapter 44, Jeremiah is going to promise judgment upon them because they run away, and ultimately they carry Jeremiah with them. So Jeremiah is taken captive by the leaders of Judah over to Egypt rather than being taken to Babylon. And he pronounces judgment upon them in chapter 44. And then chapter 45, there's a little dislocation in terms of time and when it takes place. It moves backwards in time 20 years. And Jeremiah chooses to put in right there, chapter 45, very short chapter, just 6 verses or 5 verses. And it's a word of Yahweh to Baruch, who was Jeremiah's assistant. And Yahweh had said in 605, even 20 years before, that he was going to preserve Baruch and Jeremiah, no matter where they went. And that's ultimately what we see take place, because when Jeremiah is taken down to Egypt, Baruch is taken with him. And so even though they are taken against their will, God is still going to preserve them. And you have God's loving and caring message for his servant that he will take care of him even when all of these other external circumstances are really difficult. So that's Jeremiah chapters 34 to 45, just a brief overview. I hope you have a wonderful time studying it this week, and then we'll see you again in the future as we look at more chapters in the rest of the book of Jeremiah. Thanks for watching this video from Ambassador Bible Fellowship. We exist to glorify God by multiplying disciples, leaders, and churches who believe the gospel, grow in Christ, and go to the lost. If you would like more resources on the Bible, theology, and church history, you can hit the subscribe button below or visit our website at ambassadorbiblefellowship.org.